Walmart's grocery business today is ironically inflation, as prices have gone up for a lot of items, not just food, but housing.
Even this year, they've talked about investing, I think, close to $18 billion or $17 or $18 billion in capital expenditures, a lot of which is going to go toward automation, which should help to drive, over time, better profitability.
Inflation is having an impact, particularly for those that don't have as much money. So we see them behaving in different ways.
The first satisfying cut came without warning. A sweeping wave of tariffs slammed into the American retail system, setting off a chain reaction that caught even the most powerful corporations completely off guard. Within weeks, the consequences reached every household in the country. Nobody was spared. Walmart, the company that built its empire on a simple promise of everyday low prices, was forced to do something unthinkable: walk away from parts of the American market entirely. The math no longer worked. The model that had fed millions of families for decades had been shattered by a single policy decision signed in the Rose Garden. Prices climbed almost overnight. Beef that cost $9 last month now demanded nearly $14. Lettuce jumped 30%. Breakfast cereal, the stuff kids eat every morning, cost $2 more per box. The sense of security that American shoppers had taken for granted at grocery stores across the country simply vanished. What had always felt permanent suddenly felt fragile. This is the story of what happens when political decisions collide with economic reality. When tariffs designed to punish foreign competitors end up punishing American families instead. When the backbone of retail begins to crack and nobody in Washington seems willing to stop it. The consequences are still unfolding. The crisis started with a signature. On April 2, 2025, President Trump stood in the White House Rose Garden and signed Executive Order 14257, the Liberation Day tariffs. The move was designed to put pressure on China and bring manufacturing jobs back to American soil. The intention sounded patriotic. The execution was catastrophic. Nobody anticipated how fast the damage would spread. By April 5th, nearly all imports entering the United States carried a baseline 10% tariff. Canada and Mexico received temporary exemptions. Everyone else paid immediately. 4 days later, retaliatory tariffs hit 60 countries simultaneously. China absorbed the heaviest blow, with rates soaring as high as 145% on certain goods. The global trade system that had functioned for decades began breaking apart. The ripple effects were immediate and brutal. One of Walmart's largest toy suppliers in Shenzhen slashed production by 70% within 2 weeks. Workers who had assembled products for American children for years suddenly had no orders to fill. The U.S. Toy Association issued an emergency warning that nearly half its members faced bankruptcy before the holiday season arrived. Shipping costs on routes between China and Long Beach tripled overnight. Delays that used to be measured in days stretched into weeks. The supply chain that had delivered affordable goods to American shelves for a generation was collapsing. For shoppers pushing carts through Walmart aisles, the changes were impossible to miss. Shelves that had always been fully stocked now showed gaps that employees could not fill. Price tags that had stayed stable for years suddenly jumped without explanation. The promise of affordable goods that had defined American retail for a generation was disappearing in real time. Customers who had never worried about grocery budgets began making difficult choices. Walmart's executives faced an impossible choice: absorb billions in new costs and watch profits evaporate, or pass those costs to customers already stretched thin by years of inflation. They chose a third option nobody expected: retreat. The company began shifting supply chains out of the American market entirely. Contracts with Chinese manufacturers were canceled. New deals were signed with factories in Vietnam and India. The restructuring represented the most dramatic supply chain shift in decades. But it came with consequences that reached far beyond corporate balance sheets. Communities that had depended on Walmart's presence for employment and economic stability braced for impact. By the second quarter of 2025, Walmart's losses reached an estimated $25 billion. Those numbers translated directly into pain for workers and families. Distribution centers that had operated around the clock began cutting shifts without warning. Warehouse employees who had counted on steady paychecks found their hours slashed. Benefits that families depended on were suddenly at risk. Then came the announcement that sent shockwaves through Wall Street and Main Street simultaneously. A leaked internal document called Project Sort confirmed what insiders had feared. Walmart planned to shut down 10 major distribution centers within weeks. The closures stretched from California to Florida, affecting towns and cities that had depended on those facilities for decades. These were not simple warehouses. They were economic anchors employing thousands of workers whose spending supported restaurants, gas stations, schools, and local governments across entire regions. More than 50,000 employees suddenly faced uncertain futures. Communities that had built their economies around Walmart's presence braced for ripple effects that would spread far beyond the warehouse walls. Trucking companies that hauled goods lost contracts overnight. Restaurants that fed workers lost customers. Tax revenues that funded local services began shrinking. The economic foundation of entire towns started crumbling. The pain spread internationally within days. What happened inside the United States quickly spilled across borders and oceans. Shipments of rice, cooking oil, and canned goods were halted at ports around the world. Shelves in Southeast Asia that once carried American exports were stripped bare. In Nairobi and Manila, food prices surged as supply chains fractured. Families already living on tight budgets were pushed into even more desperate circumstances. The crisis born in Washington reached dinner tables on every continent. President Trump responded by lashing out at Walmart publicly, accusing the company of betraying American workers by shifting production overseas. The attack only deepened the crisis and created more uncertainty. Investors panicked. Stock prices plummeted. The confrontation between the White House and the nation's largest retailer became front-page news around the world. Markets that craved stability received chaos instead. On May 2nd, the situation escalated further. Trump threatened a 50% tariff on European imports, unless the European Union accepted his terms immediately. Markets across Europe lost $180 billion in value within 3 days. German auto exports ground to a halt as dealerships canceled orders. Stock indexes dropped sharply from London to Frankfurt. Decades of trade relationships built on trust began unraveling. Asia faced equal chaos. South Korea absorbed a sudden 25% tariff that put half of Hyundai and Kia's American exports at risk. The Bank of Korea projected steep job losses across the automotive sector that had driven the nation's economy for decades. Supply chains that had taken years to build began unraveling in weeks. The disruption exposed how deeply connected the global economy had become, and how quickly those connections could turn into vulnerabilities when trust disappeared. For Walmart's workers, the consequences were immediate and personal. With fewer shipments arriving, work hours evaporated without warning. Overtime that many families depended on during summer months disappeared entirely. Schedules became a scramble for survival, as employees rotated shifts, hoping to hold on to some income. Workers who had built careers at these facilities suddenly faced unemployment. Labor unions condemned the tariff policies with unusual directness. These measures were not only targeting foreign producers, they were inflicting deep wounds on the American workers they claimed to protect. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. Politicians promised revival while workers experienced devastation. At the end of May, confusion deepened further. The U.S. Court of International Trade ruled that the president had overstepped his authority and suspended most tariffs temporarily. But instead of relief, the decision created chaos. Nobody knew if the tariffs would return. Nobody knew if they would grow even harsher when suspension ended. Companies could not plan. Workers could not predict their futures. The uncertainty itself became a form of economic damage that spread through every sector. Walmart braced for a $25 billion quarterly loss with no end in sight. Shifting supply chains away from China proved far more difficult than corporate planners had anticipated. Vietnamese factories hit capacity limits almost immediately. Garment producers in Hanoi reported 6-month backlogs that could not be shortened. Electronics manufacturers in India faltered without access to Chinese components that had no available substitutes. The logistics numbers became staggering. Shipping costs from Asia to the United States doubled in 3 weeks. A container that once cost $3,500 to move now required $6,500, with projections reaching $8,500 by summer. Sailings were canceled without notice. Ports were skipped entirely. Delays of 2 weeks became standard across every route. Small and mid-sized businesses suffered alongside the giants. Banks restricted loans to import-dependent companies. Venture capital fled logistics startups. Credit agencies downgraded outlooks across retail and manufacturing sectors. The spiral widened every week with no bottom in sight. Warehouses filled beyond capacity as companies scrambled to stockpile goods before new tariffs hit. Storage rental rates quadrupled in weeks. Some facilities created waiting lists for the first time in their history. Meanwhile, Walmart's shuttered distribution centers turned into graveyards of unsold inventory. Products expired on loading docks. Losses mounted daily without any path to recovery. Agriculture absorbed some of the heaviest damage. Refrigerated containers filled with beef and produce sat at ports with nowhere to go. Exports spoiled in the summer heat, while farmers watched helplessly. Farmers who had barely recovered from previous trade wars watched their progress erased overnight. American beef, once a global staple, became a symbol of waste and broken trade routes. For families across the country, the consequences compounded with each passing week. Economists estimated that tariffs would add $1,000 to annual household expenses. Walmart's chief financial officer confirmed the grim reality on national television. Beef prices reached $14 per pound. Patio furniture jumped $60. Child car seats increased by $100. Items that families needed became items families could no longer afford. Even Walmart's online marketplace collapsed under the pressure. Thousands of small businesses selling through the platform faced devastating cost increases. Many raised prices beyond what customers could afford. Others withdrew products entirely. The ecosystem that had supported entrepreneurs nationwide was breaking apart faster than anyone could repair. By the height of summer, the evidence was undeniable. Walmart's legendary logistics model had collapsed. Container ships floated offshore, unable to unload cargo. Suburban store aisles stood empty. Families paid more for less while thousands of workers joined unemployment lines. The system that had delivered affordable goods for decades had stopped functioning. Political leaders continued insisting that tariffs would rebuild domestic industry. The evidence told a different story. Instead of manufacturing revival, households faced rising costs and growing scarcity. Instead of job creation, communities watched employers disappear. The question now is straightforward but uncomfortable. How much more pressure can this system absorb before it breaks completely? If Walmart, with its global scale and deep resources, cannot survive this environment, what happens to smaller businesses facing identical pressures? What happens to the families who depend on affordable goods that no longer exist? And what happens to an economy when the foundation of retail crumbles beneath it? Subscribe now to follow this crisis as it unfolds. The consequences are only beginning.